Well, Peter, the first question is, how do I come to do what I'm doing? I consider myself a teacher and a scholar more than anything else of environmental history and history of science at the college level. And I don't want to get into too much detail, but I'm a child of non-academics. I never thought I'd go into academia or into scholarship at all. I started in hotel restaurant business type of majors when I was at Florida International University down in Florida. And it was when I was an undergraduate and taking my general education courses that I realized that there was something beyond making money. There was something beyond waiting tables, which I was doing at the Olive Garden at the same time. And I started to contemplate for the first time, devoting myself to just kind of thinking and talking and reading as a way of life. And when I made that decision when I was about 20 or 21 years old, that was it, basically. And everything else has been a series of accidents, very, very happy accidents. I started at Florida International University, took a degree in liberal studies, and then ended up at University of Florida and did American history, and then found myself working with a wonderful gentleman named Greg Mittman, who was at the University of Oklahoma. And what interested me about that was that he was working on a project that brought together environmental history and history of science, which is kind of old school right now. Everyone's doing it. But back then in the early to mid 90s, it was kind of a new hybrid. And so I asked if I could work with him, and I took a degree in history of science, which is all obviously mostly about research and taking your classes and doing your writing. And then I was fortunate enough about 12 years ago to get a job at SUNY Plattsburgh, where I've had to reinvent myself as a teacher and a scholar, and I haven't really looked back since. Now, the other part of me, so I spent almost all of my time within the university and thinking about how to teach and how to deliver the best experience for my students. That's my bread and butter. But every now and then we get these little moments in time where we get to think about things that we really like to think about. I got interested in a long time ago as a Rachel Carson scholar, like everyone else. Everyone has to spend a few moments of their life as a Rachel Carson scholar. And I started off with the Silent Spring stuff, and then I realized that in order to understand Carson, you really had to look at her ocean work in the 40s and the 50s and take that really seriously. And that one notion actually created the dissertation, which then became a book on America's ocean wilderness. And I've always been fascinated with explorers, with scientists or naturalists going out into the field and representing these great spaces and bringing those representations back into museum spaces or into, it could be a zoo or anywhere in popular culture. And in a way, that story was about how explorers in the 20th century, very popular explorers, shaped the way Americans think about oceanic spaces, right? And I'm doing something roughly the same now. I'm interested in roadkill. We've talked. The people here at IAS have had to endure too many talks on not very happy subjects, but I'm now find myself interested in the same group of naturalists, right? But instead of being in ocean spaces, I find that they're inhabiting the verge, the roadway, and they're tending to the built environments of transportation systems and environments in the same ways that Jacques Cousteau would be exploring the Indian Ocean. So that's basically what I've been doing over the past couple months and the larger project over the past couple of years. And I heard a wonderful quote. I can't remember who it was, but it was this semester. Someone said, "Don't write a book unless you're absolutely passionately obsessed with a subject." And well, my students will know this as well. This is a subject that the history of roadkill, that it's really kind of gotten right into my heart, and so I know I may not produce anything interesting, but I feel like it's headed in the right direction.
What a great lot of things. Let's start with Florida, just for the heck of it. What's it like to come to intellectual awareness and curiosity about the world in Florida?
I didn't grow up. I grew up in Florida, but Florida is an imagined space. Okay, I grew up in suburbia, right? Sunbelt suburbia. It could have been anywhere. It could have been Southern California. It could have been in Arizona. Could have been in parts of Georgia in the South. That's what I grew up in, and I have spent the last 30 years apologizing. I grew up in the suburbs in Florida. I don't have a place, right? I always think of Florida as this really interesting hybrid. South Florida is this interesting hybrid of Long Island and Cuba kind of smashed together, and Haiti as well, and lots of other places. Um, and I never felt that I was really a part of Florida. I was just part of the suburbs. And, I went to the ocean, but, we laid on the beach. I went into the Everglades, but I never was a child of the Everglades. And so for many years, I tried to, I was sorry. I was filled with remorse that my childhood in the suburbs was rootless, was American in a rather trite way, that it was without place, okay? But the suburbs are a place too. This is what I've come to realize fairly recently. And I think people who come from, either affluent or middle income suburbs have a special set of challenges in trying to define themselves as people. That could be as academicians or as people in the business field. But it's time to start embracing, I think, the realness of that suburban experience. I'll be honest with you, I think the suburbs are a challenge to people who like to think for a living. It's literally true. It's about conformity. It's about playing a game with neighborhoods that sometimes is community building, but more often is it's dehumanizing. And so you have to kind of shed that in order to kind of move into the world of the mind, I would say. That's why people who live in cities and grow up in cities tend to be, in my opinion, just a little more cosmopolitan, a little more critical in their thinking, and they tend to be, in my mind, a little better intellectuals. Us from the suburbs, well, we scrap it out and try to do what we can. So it's a good question, but it's not about Florida, it's about the suburbs.
So how did you shed it? How did you shed whatever the suburban...
Yeah. It's got to be general education. It has to be. You go through high school, and I was a good student and got A's and everything, but that's not learning. High school and primary education is not about critical thinking and learning. I wish it was. And my teachers were fantastic. I loved all of them. Well, I loved most of them. But all of a sudden you get to this new world of academia. This is something that you're interested in. And you realize that there's this entire universe of people doing things that I had never known, right? And so I was part of what was called FIU's Faculty Scholars Program, which is kind of an honors program. And, they had learning communities and lots of interesting events where people would be speaking. And I remember being in a class with Mitch Medic, who was the president of that campus. And it was on public policy and something or other, and Janet Reno was one of many of the really interesting people who came in. And it wasn't until many years later that I realized, hey, wait, we met some really interesting people. But the point is that kind of movement out of the suburbs into this, I don't even want to go into ivory tower talk. It's just a different space where people are motivated by a different set of values. And, I'm a big fan of state education. FIU is about educating the people of South Florida. And when I saw that, I realized, I didn't realize right there that this is what I wanted to do. But I always knew I wanted to be around places like FIU. And, why would anybody want to be anywhere else? I understand why people don't, but college towns are just fantastic.
You're committed to teaching. What's that about, given where you came from, and how you woke up?
I don't know how to answer that, Peter. It's a great question. In a way, it's just expected of you, right? If my life is a series of happy accidents, the last accident was falling into a position where a large chunk of my life is about teaching. I don't think I was ever called to do so. But once you spend a hot August afternoon on the first weekend before classes start helping 18-year-olds and their parents move their furniture and their belongings up into their dorms, you begin to appreciate that something interesting is going on when they're 18, 19, when they're freshmen and sophomore, juniors. And just like I went through that incredible transition by looking at faculty that I admire and still continue to admire greatly today, I know that they're in a very similar place that I was. And I do not want them to turn into a bunch of I don't want to turn them into a bunch of historians, but I do want them to understand the vital importance of critical thinking to our civic good, to what it means to be a citizen of the United States or a citizen of any country in the world. So it's just knowing, and now as I get older, and much older, I appreciate that more and more, that moment when they just leave their parents' or their grandparents' house for the first time. And it actually, it means that we need to take our jobs even more seriously, because that moment is it can be traumatic, actually, and it often is. And it's not like we have to monitor everything that's going on, but we do have to see them as in a place of, they need to be tended to, with a kind of care that you don't get in graduate school. You have to kind of figure that out as you go along. And I've had a lot of good mentors to show me the way, especially at Plattsburgh.
You mentioned this guy who was combining, I think it was environmental studies and history of science.
Right, Craig Whitman.
And I don't, initially that doesn't light up any neurons for me.
Sure.
That idea of the combination. But to you it's really important, so I kind of want to know why.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. Actually that's who I am, right? History of science is an old discipline. It's an old academic discipline that goes back to really the 20s and 30s, but then explodes after World War II. And so you can find all the great doyens, the great historians of science, usually at some of our more august institutions all around the country. You have a wonderful history of science and technology medicine program right here at Minneapolis. And so, my formal training was in history of science, right? But if you think about what scientists do, especially life scientists, biologists and ecologists, you quickly realize that many ecologists get in the work of either environmental reform, environmental mediation, and that brings us into the world of environmental history, which, environmental history as a discipline has its roots in historical geology. It also has further roots in anthropology, I would argue. Even Kroll, for going way back into the early part of the 20th century, is doing something that you could call environmental history. But really, as a discipline that we know it today, it's a child of the 1970s. It's a child of the U.S. environmental movement in the U.S. context. And many environmental historians in those early years tended to look at science as a rock bed of data that informs environmental debates. History of science, especially in the 90s when all the social construction stuff was going on, kind of destabilized that a little bit to say, wait a second, let's look a little more carefully at the social practices of science. Okay, these aren't just people who go out and see the universe and spit out truth and say, all right, just fix this and that, and you'll have a perfect environmental system restored. They're people who are deeply inflected by social, economic, moral values, religious values that leach their way into their science. No matter how hard they try, that's part of what they do, and it's part of the knowledge systems that they create. So the hybrid of history, science, and environmental history is an important one. It looks at science like any other very, very important institution that you would situate within a culture, to say, look, it's a human creation. And as a result, I think that both environmental history and history of science it's been greatly enriched. I think the interbreeding has gone in both directions. I would say that just as much as environmental history has benefited from history of science, it works in exactly the opposite direction too. And it's very popular. Students have been working on this. Well, it was very popular when I was in graduate school too. So that would be in the late 1990s. And now there's just lots and lots of kids out there doing wonderful, wonderful work. So it's a disciplinary story, but it's an important one that goes to who I am.
Can you just to get a little anchor from
Yeah.
me? If you just tell me what kind of question an environmental historian goes after. What are the sort of the big things that environmental historians have chased down?
Absolutely. There's different ways of thinking about it. Most environmental historians say, well, environmental history is about 3 different things, and there's probably more like 5 or 10 or 20. But basically, environmental historians are trying to figure out how humans are impacted in transforming landscapes, right? And so William Cronin, who just gave a lecture here last week, his very, very important famous book, Changes in the Land, came out in early 80s, 83, I think, looked at how Native Americans in New England were transforming their landscape, and then the change is when Europeans come. How does the landscape adapt, change? How is it destroyed? How is it managed as a result of these human habitations and the colonial project, right? So that's the basic thing. Another brand of environmental history can be called basically just intellectual history or cultural history. How do humans think about nature? How does the natural world factor into our cultural representations, into our repertoire of how we understand the world? And I'm actually a little closer to that universe. It's less material and more about cognition in the mind. And then the last one is the third one is about environmental movements and conservation movements, and it's about parks and forests and the work that humans have done to mediate and to mitigate some of the negative influences of the Industrial Revolution or what have. This is the work of environmentalists essentially, and there are thousands of permutations on this, and I don't think anybody can say this is all I do. We all kind of do little hybrids, but when I have to tell my students this is what environmental history is all about, it breaks down to those 3 pretty easily.
So, for example, Ken Burns' epical history of the national parks would be a central document in environmental history.
Well,
in the popular
yes.
world.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And many environmental historians, if I remember, I want to think Don Wooster. Don Wooster is another one of our great important people, and perhaps Bill Cronin were on that. There were a bunch of talking heads on that program, and yeah, absolutely. Park histories had their day in the sun. They were very popular, I'd say, in the 1990s and so. And we've kind of backed off of it a little bit, I'd say, as a field. But absolutely, it's really important. And since most Americans kind of feel like their great nature or wilderness experiences are in those national parks, Burns did a really good job there, kind of deconstructing those histories. I use it routinely in my classes just to kind of, if we're talking about, creation of Yellowstone Park and kind of merging that with the history of the West type of thing. I like to show little snippets just so students can, I like the narrative. I've always been a Burns fan, but also they can see how these landscapes actually looked. And so it's a very powerful document and a fun one too. And it's a long one.
Would you rope in also the other Burns documentary, Rick Burns on New York, the story of the creation of Central Park? Is that another one of those? Is Olmsted another person you guys pay attention to?
Absolutely. You got to put Olmsted into the context of the kind of, the urban critique that urbanity in late 19th century America or the world is making us either too sedentary, it's making our bodies flabby, or it's killing us. We're, in diseased environments, and so we have to find a way to get back to nature, right? And that's where you situate the work of Olmsted. You create a piece of wilderness right in the middle of this sprawling metropolis. Yeah, environmental historians, a good number of them have looked at this as well. And those are, we call them middle landscapes, right? So a park is, it's natural. We can not get that one. It's not really, they're clearly trees and bushes and grasses and animals, but it's also very managed as well. And so, just like a farm is a hybrid environment between a natural environment and human culture, so too is Olmsted. So in a way, those stories come together.
I see. Well, now they have a sense of what environmental history is. How does environmental history then lean on science and treat, as you're saying, science as the bedrock facts they need to...
Well, I don't think we do it anymore. I think that environmental historians are much better at it. Here's the way to think about it. Back in the 1930s, there was this great ecologist. His name is Frederick Clements. All botanists and ecologists know who Clements is. He's the founder of community ecology. And he's this Nebraskan guy who goes out and counts little pieces of grass and came up with these theories of succession, community succession. And when the Dust Bowl came around, he started getting involved, and he's one of many people who started saying, hey, wait a second, maybe the farming communities in the Plain States during the 1920s disrupted a system and created the Dust Bowl. Okay, I'm Frederick Clements, I as the ecologist will give you the tools in order to understand how to take that moving soil, that Dust Bowl, and root it back and keep it there on the plains instead of eroding out into God knows where. And so I would say many environmental historians would look at someone like Clements and say he is the interpreter of nature. He can speak for nature to a certain extent. And there's a very important book, 2 books by Don Wooster. This is one of our founding figures. That were really important, and so it's tricky business when we use scientific sources in order to interpret environmental history of a region, right? But what I think happened in the late 90s and in the 80s and 90s is that we started to kind of look at ecologists like Clements to see how they are kind of culturally motivated and part of a story of the United States West, essentially, or expansion, or Indian wars, or the movements of various religious beliefs. And to see how, Clements is more than just the spokesperson of nature. He's a fallible human like everyone else, and it's important to see him as a historical actor with all the contingency and ambiguities. As it's more important to see him that way than to see him as the authority who will show us the way. Does that make sense? Yeah. It's a tricky question.
Well, I'm thinking now of somebody I know a little bit about, mm-hmm. Wes Jackson,
sure.
who seems to be trying to lay down both an environmental history that is normative, essentially, had quite a beautiful ecosystem on the Great Plains that, in every respect you can imagine, got wrecked. And the wrecking of it made it pretty much useless for the purposes it was wrecked for. And so there's actually a story about what needs to happen in the future, which is a managed restoration of something that never should have been wrecked. Yeah. There's both a history and a direction forward.
Oh, absolutely. I don't know an environmental historian who wouldn't say that part of our mission is to find solutions for living in an environment in a more friendly, in a social environment and a natural environment in a more in a less destructive manner. I don't really know how effective we are. Maybe Wes Jackson is certainly more effective than I am, and you know, I do think that that is one of the things the field has to think about, and they have been, and all academics have this problem. How, you know, if we do have anything to offer in terms of social solutions, what will they be? And we all think about it, and we all write about it a little bit, but I mean, we should probably be doubling down on that practice.
Well, I mean, Jackson has in some ways got a kind of case for something like the buffalo commons.
Yeah.
I guess it'll get wrecked by all this oil in North Dakota, but there's not a lot else that would keep the buffalo commons from coming into North It'd be kind of cute to have the buffalo and the oil rigs kind of coexisting.
Well, I think thinking about that is interesting to me. You know, and the idea of the buffalo there's a recent book out on rambunctious gardens. I can't remember the name of the author, and she makes this argument that we really have to give up on this idea of wilderness as a space that is untouched by human beings, right? And instead, we need to kind of almost become easy with ourselves and accept the idea that, you know, nature and culture are kind of intertwined, and as much time as we spend ripping invasives out of forests, that maybe there's another way, right? Maybe we can see certain invasive species and native species creating novel ecosystems. And when you mention, you know, the buffalo kind of browsing around underneath, the oil rigs or the fracking institutions, that's I think an environment that I'd rather not have the oil rigs or the fracking institutions, by the way, but to try to, you know, make that compromise and understand that we can have and enjoy natural values and recreate natural values, but maybe not that pristine, non-human type of nature. If we keep on going after that brass ring, we're going to always be disappointed, I think.
Well, one of the revelations for me from just little teeny bits of reading and hearing I've done over the years is that lots of environments that I thought were natural in that pristine way weren't.
Right.
That they're the result of fairly, you know, serious interventions and sometimes in prehistoric times and intentional reshaping.
If environmental historians have been helpful in any way, it's been hopefully, I think, in showing how those purportedly natural spaces, wild spaces, are very much the product of human intervention. And you know, this isn't a bad thing. I mean, we all love to go hiking. We all love, most of us love to go hiking, and we do enjoy nature. But you know, in a way, kind of getting out of that myth of wilderness as an untouched landscape is an important one. And I think the game's been won, and that most people in America can look at any landscape and not fall into the trap of thinking that it's a mythic, pristine, prelepsarian paradise. So I don't know if we can thank environmental historians for it, but they played a role.
Yeah. And is there something good about knowing that or thinking that way?
I'm not sure yet. I'm actually, something's changing in the world right now of environmental management, and we're seeing these hybrid spaces being tended to as hybrid spaces in interesting and compelling ways, and there are a bunch of examples. And can we look at the works of environmental history as kind of inflecting and kind of seeping into this broader conversation about how are we going to manage our environment. And on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I say, yeah, absolutely. And on Tuesday and Thursday, I scratch my head and I'm not really quite sure. So does it feel good? Sure, I suppose. Bringing it back to where we started, my satisfaction actually, I like to produce good scholarship, right? But very few of us have the kind of luck and skill to create scholarship that can have that kind of an impact. And really, the kind of stuff I'm talking about regarding these hybrid spaces is really, Greg Mittman is an example of a person who was able to do this, but certainly William Cronin more than anybody else, and Don Wooster. Those are the folks that kind of set the agenda, and we're just doing the mop-up work, I feel like. And so I'm happy for the discipline. I wish that my own scholarship would have a similar impact in the years to come, and that's why, another way to interpret your question is to ask, what brings you joy, and I get joy from the students, right? That's my audience, usually a captive audience, and if I can help them to understand the history of the human interactions with the environment and see that critical understanding start to take place in the space of a semester, then I'm happy. That's what I like to do.
So they're living in these hybrid spaces.
Absolutely.
And if they think of these hybrid spaces as fallen humanity and the spoiling of something, they have one picture. And if they see these hybrid spaces as interesting spaces that can be managed more or less well, and about which they have some choices, they see it a different way. That's
the goal. That is the goal. The goal, my personal goal, is I want my students to see every space as my first day of teaching at Plattsburgh, there was this wonderful blackboard. It's a slate blackboard. I didn't plan this at all. I just walked into the classroom. I hadn't prepped too much for it. And I saw it there. And I was already becoming accustomed to the whiteboards, the reckless hegemony of the whiteboard. And I saw that slate board, and so I just kind of hugged it for a second, and I felt and I asked all the students to come up and feel the blackboard. I know that sounds strange. But then we started asking questions like, where does this come from? Is this produced somehow, or is this a product of nature? Or is it a product of nature that's been transformed somehow? And so we started, that was our first little project, is to understand the environmental history of the blackboard. It's kind of a mundane practice. Mm-hmm. But I want them to be able to, I remember that day that an insect was walking across the floor. I can't remember what it was. And one of the students stomped it out before the class actually began, and it was big to do. And so we're talking about the naturalness of this classroom. Even the plastic in the chairs, right, has that origin in petrochemicals, which has its origin from other places. And so she said, well, that bug wasn't the part of our natural environment. And I'm like, look, dirt is just soil that's out of place, which is a very famous quote from an anthropologist. And I want them to be able, I don't care about the classroom or their dorms per se, I want them to be able to move to their homes, wherever they are, to see their driveway, their houses, their apartments. I want them to see their lawns and their neighborhoods as environments that are as worthy of meticulous attention as Anwar, Yellowstone, etc. Yellowstone's in your backyard. I tell this to my students all the time. And that idea is starting to catch, we've got a long way to go, but if there's going to be any saving grace for American agriculture, it is suburbia in all that wonderful space that's out there. We could turn that all into productive, forget the buffalo commons. I'll grow wheat in my backyard. It'd be fantastic. Anyway, those are the type of things that we like to talk about in our class.
Yeah, when I was quite young, my life was turned around by a book called Science in Your Own Backyard from the Weekly Reader Book Club or something.
I don't know that one.
It'll be hard to find.
Okay.
But one needs to find it because you couldn't ever be that basic these days.
Right.
The gifted programs have wrecked being that basic. You have to go to Gerald Durrell's Naturalist Handbook, which is, but Gerald Durrell's really good too, and that was my youth. And there are people from the 50s, from that science, the non-Sputnik end of the science ed, who were trying to get people to pay appropriate attention,
absolutely,
to where they lived,
and that does go back to back to the Olmsted's time. There's this movement called nature study that Sally Kolstad, who is a professor here in Minneapolis, she wrote a book on this, and it's that idea that that we have to change our school systems, our primary system, like just kids, right? And they're in the cities, they're not interacting with nature. We've got to find a way to bring nature to them or get them out into the field, and that's exactly what you're describing too. It's exciting.
We just lost a great heroine of that in '83, Konigsberg.
Sure.
The View from Saturday. She's of course all over both science but also sociology, especially understanding social relations with that kind of look in your own backyard. You'll see everything that's important. So there's a long tradition of helping people to look at their own environment carefully and right.
The trick, though, Peter, is it's one thing to have my students see their backyard as places where they can grow mushrooms and broccoli, the edible mushrooms. But there's this other world of the state, which makes big decisions, government, which makes big decisions about how environments are going to be managed. And you can't teach the state, right? You can't. Our access to them is kind of, it's scientists have an inroad into that world, but historians very much, you see it every now and then, but it's very much rare the case where historians would be involved in helping with that conversation. But we can always hope for the future, I suppose.
So, roadkill.
Yeah.
Animals trying to cross busy freeways. Freeways built in the middle of migration patterns and nesting areas and things like that. What have you been working on there?
Okay. This semester, it's been, for the last 3 months, I've been doing nothing but roadkill. And it is a history, so I'm just interested in a couple different things. I'm interested in how not just highways get built, but how do highway environments get built. And so that's the highway, the right-of-way, and the land use that's flanking that. And so, I've tried to uncover some of the work of landscape engineers or landscape designers and architects who created these spaces, never thinking that they would be inhabited or crossed by animals. It's more about maintenance and aesthetics and stuff like that, but they're still building these built environments. And those are the folks that created the environments through which many of our organisms would be traveling around. And so I found a lot of interesting things, but between the 1920s and 1940, when automobiles really started to get ramped up, this is before the interstates, there turned out to be a whole bunch of naturalists, just like my ocean folks, that got really concerned about how cars could possibly be, what they called a significant force of mortality, right? Perhaps it was going to lead to species extinction, which they were becoming familiar with buffaloes and pigeons and so forth. And so there was this wide discussion about, surprisingly wide discussion about how detrimental the automobile or the highway can be to the existence of a species. And so I just track arguments like that. Most of those conversations happen in the upper Midwest around Iowa, in the Dakotas, and you have a wonderful community of naturalists kind of circulating there, but also in California and New York, any place you have driving done. And then, and I kind of bring the story up into the interstate period and that's all about deer. I have a whole wonderful section on deer because in the 1950s and 60s, deer populations began to go up very, very high. You guys in Minnesota realize this; they're all over the place. That began because of the success of wildlife managers, and it's at exactly the same point that America's driving habits, same thing. So we have a lot more cars going faster, doing a lot more driving, and there are a lot more deer around as well, and so these deer auto collisions became an accident. It became a problem, and then that brought wildlife managers. They brought wildlife managers to the verge, essentially, and that kind of created this new techniques and strategies for trying to figure out how to deal with wildlife. And so I talk about that, and many of those folks in the 70s and 80s, what they wanted to do was create a highway that was as hard and as impenetrable as possible, so that when the deer comes to the street, they just turn the other way. The final section of what I've been working on shows how that order is changing. Today, through the work of environmental activists and also this group of scientists, they call themselves roadecologists, they're trying to create highways now, or at least design or think about highways that are not impermeable, but rather that will let nutrients and energy and water and animals, obviously, flow in either direction. So it's there are very few these permeable highways. America has about 4 million miles of highways, and you can still count on fingers and toes the number of highway crossings that have been planned over the past couple of years. But it's an interesting story that is, it fills my heart with joy, actually, to see that there are people out there who are tending to the mobilities of animals, which, at the end of the day, if you think about roadkill, we're talking about a lot of skunks, squirrels, raccoons, and deer. There are plenty of these organisms around. What's the big deal? It's not about the species that's involved. It's about the nature of the killing that's involved. That kind of bothers me not as a historian, but as a citizen. The collision of an animal with a car or a boat or a plane or a train is something that I find disturbing as a moral agent. And it turns out I'm not alone. Many of the people who I've been studying, even when they don't say it, I can usually detect it a little, do have that kind of uneasiness with modern transportation, with the way we move our bodies around this earth. And that's basically the moral of this whole story, is to see this incredible experiment in automobility, where we began moving our bodies and our goods around America and around the world in unthinkably, I should say, fast ways. And animals got in the way. And we never thought about designing highways that kind of work with the environment. And so, but a bunch of people have been doing that and been paying a lot of attention to it. And that's what the story is. So, And so, I don't know if you want to hear too much more about this, but there's roadkill. But I do see roadkill as having a story in common with bird strikes. So when birds hit airplanes, right? It's the same type of phenomenon. It's the same type of science. Circulates around airfields and around the creation of these new birds, which are called snarge by the Smithsonian Lab. And you could say the same thing about manatees, the poster child of all of these kind of collisions, or cattle in trains in the 19th century. And so what the book tries to do is to not just focus on roadkill and cars and highways, but to look at fossil fuel transportation over the course of the late 19th and early 20th century, and to see how environments have been created, wildlife has moved through, they've gotten hit, and people have had to clean it up. And so that's what the story is all about.
how do you make a highway to be less likely to kill animals?
It's easy. Don't build the highway, first of all. Design it carefully, right? The most effective way of making a permeable highway is to design it properly right at the start, and to, bring your biologists in, your ecologists in, to do wildlife surveys to figure out what, at least at that moment, the travel habits of the organisms in the area is. Where is the water flowing? Highways running through wetlands that's a huge issue as well. That kind of speaks to the same type of permeability issues. But at the end of the day, a permeable highway to wildlife is just about culverts and underpasses. So what you do is you dig under the highway, you put a big concrete culvert, you make sure it's the right size, and then what you do is you put fencing up around the culvert, not around but along the culvert. So what you do is you funnel and kind of manipulate the movement of animals and encourage them, if they want to get to the other side, please follow this direction instead of going across the highway. So it's, at the end of the day, there's no way to reduce roadkill to zero. But there are effective ways of lessening the problem. But it's not cheap. Every time you want to put in an underpass, you have to increase the budget of a state project. The question is, does the cost outweigh, or does the benefit outweigh the cost? And one way of thinking about it, obviously, is, you don't want, I see it as the moral agent. I just don't want the killing to happen. But a more pragmatic way of thinking about it, obviously, is to say, all right, well, every deer collision has a financial cost, not just to the deer, but mostly to the car. 200 people, human beings, are killed in these kind of accidents every year as well. There's human cost as well. So one very powerful way of legitimizing the costs of a permeable highway is just to realize that we've been paying it for it all along. We just didn't realize it. So let's just design better highways, or stop driving, which is my favorite way.
Do you have? Are there numbers on what gets killed? How many things get killed? How many? What the kind of cost is to the insurance industry of these collisions, stuff like that?
The data is much better today than it was, say, 10 years ago. But it's still, we'd like it to be a lot better. And that is a universal in all of these chapters, right? Everyone wants better data. How many birds are being killed? How many manatees are being run over? And so we do know, for instance, we know that there are 1 million claims go into insurance agencies every year for deer collisions. And so a 2008 report to Congress estimated that somewhere between 1 and 1.5 million deer are actually killed every year on the highways. And they actually put a number to that, and it's over $8 billion. Now, those numbers can be interpreted in lots of different ways, and I don't know if I use that number very, very carefully, because I don't know how much faith and trust I have in that number, nor that we even need it. But it is, I would say, an issue that does deserve attention from all state departments of transportation, and surprisingly, in my mind, they are responding. The state departments, right here in Minnesota, you have a very enlightened group of people that are trying to maintain both the habitats in interesting ways and minimize the wildlife strikes here on your Minnesotan highways. And every state has kind of stepped up, some less than others. Right now, Montana is way ahead of everybody. It used to be Florida in the 1990s. Florida had the corner on creating these interesting highways, but now Montana is showing really incredible signs of moving in the right direction. But it's a culture change. It's going away from designing highways only for the mobilities of humans to then changing your mind and saying, no, we're creating environments. We have to think carefully about the mobilities of both human beings traveling at 75 miles per hour in both directions and the animals that keep on using these places as natural environments. So, I don't know, $8 billion over here and a new form of grisly death on the other. I'm not sure how it's going to weigh out. China.
I lived for a while in a household with a Supreme Court justice from Minnesota who drove to work from a little farm, Lake Elmo, was always talking about the road she was driving on, crossing bird travel patterns, and all these birds she saw dying dead on the side of the road, and it's heartbreaking because we build these roads right across the areas they're customarily crossing, and have crossed for probably thousands of years. With a sense of this shouldn't happen, but I think as a Supreme Court justice, she probably didn't think she could do anything about it. And again, you can't. In a sense, you're limited to what, absolutely to what cases can be brought. But has anybody taken a legal route? I mean, when I came into ethics, environmental ethics, there was Christopher Stone's book, Should Trees Have Standing?
Classic.
I mean, can deer have standing? Has anybody suggested that deer have standing?
No. However, there are examples. I've never seen it in roadkill material, and I haven't looked to see if there are any examples of this down in Florida. Okay, I'm going to look into that. Over on the bird plane story, though, it's a lot different. There is a wonderful middle ground at the JFK Airport. The runway goes right into Jamaica Bay National Wildlife Refuge, right? And I'm forgetting the specifics. JFK has had to deal with lots of birds in their environmental spaces. And, since the 60s, they've tried to develop strategies to find out ways to keep the birds away, essentially. And it was, I'm stretching my mind, I'm not into my bird chapter right now. I believe it was in the early 1990s that JFK, the Port Authority, decided to use a shooting program. Okay, not just pyrotechnics to scare the birds away, but if the birds are there on the flight strip during a time of critical importance when a plane is either taking off or landing, that they would shoot it out of the sky, and they still do this routinely. When that happened, the Fund for Animals, which is an animal rights organization in New York City, raised their hand right away, and they sued on the grounds that the proper environmental impact statements hadn't been filed. So what some animal activists have done, and these cases are very rare in this world, is use that 1970 legislation on environmental impact statements, and with the Florida panther, certainly the Endangered Species Acts are implicated, as well as with about 22 other organisms in the United States. To kind of force transportation officials to at least kind of think a little more carefully, make this a little bit more of a public discourse. Now, I don't think their actions have actually been all that successful, but, and you said it right, what can you do? What are your options as a person, as a citizen, or even as a person who's really cares about air transportation and wants to have people safe in their planes? I mean, it's logical. You want to help something like that. And so that's why, this world that I'm dealing with is actually really kind of depressing, because all of my folks want to do something about these problems, but they're pulling their hair out, and they're like, well, what can we do to minimize this problem just a little bit? Environmental activists are the same way. There have been a number in the 1950s. The Humane Society had a July 4th roadkill count. They'd go on out, they had just like the Audubon Society does their Christmas bird count. And so they go out on July 4th, and they'd count up, all the roadkill, and then they'd extrapolate, and they said, it looks like 1 million vertebrates are being killed every day on American highways. And this project continued into, God, it was, I think, 1961 or 1962, and then they just stopped, right? And I haven't interviewed anybody involved. I'm dying to do that. But I've read a couple articles that suggested that the members basically didn't see that their work was doing any good. And they, like, okay, great, we can catalog the great, number of vertebrates that are being killed on the highways every day, every year. But to what end? And everyone's losing interest, and we're getting criticisms because we really should be more concerned about the 40,000 people that are killed in automobile crashes instead of, the million little turtles and snakes that get snarged every day. Well, I'm losing my train of thought, Peter. I'm so sorry. Coming back to that question of not knowing what to do about it, in a way, I kind of feel like I'm in a similar situation. I don't know what the moral of my story is, and I want my moral of the story to be: everyone slow down, everyone stop, just think about the place that you're in right now. So that way we don't need these infrastructures. But I'm also not so naive as to say that that's not a viable solution, and that's why I like the permeable highway. And the Defenders of the Environment, an environmental organization, had this wonderful campaign in all throughout the first decade of the 21st century called Habitat and Highways. And they said, I love this, they said, look, we can't fight the highways. It's just too big. We don't know what to do about it. So is there a way we can work with them a little bit? And that was just absolutely genius. Tricia White is an environmental activist who was at the center of that campaign. And in my mind, if there are going to be heroes to the story, and there are lots of heroes in all of these stories, wonderful people, but that one is one I'm particularly happy. And every time I feel bad about the world, I just read something about the permeable highways, and I'm like, okay, this makes sense.
Well, the emblematic animal that conservatives love to hate is the spotted owl.
Yeah.
I gather that if a highway could somehow be shown to be doing in a spotted owl,
Mm-hmm.
that would be a really big deal. Is that right?
Yeah. The Florida panther is the great example, right? It's so there's probably about 120 of them left now, which is they're actually up on the rebound because of a captive breeding program. But going all the way back to really the 50s and 60s, there were probably not more than 20 or 30 of these organisms running around. And so, they're listed as an endangered species in 1973. And everyone's kind of scratching their head trying to figure out what's going on. And in the 1960s, Florida built a clumsy highway called Alligator Alley, and it stretched between Naples and Fort Lauderdale. I remember driving on it as a kid. Slaughter Alley was the nickname, and people would be hitting each other, and lots of wildlife getting crunched here. And certainly that stretch of road was also implicated in the killing of the very, very few number of golden panthers that were actually left. Now, you started by framing it in terms of conservativeness and the controversy of the spotted owls. Florida did something interesting, and it was probably a little bit about the Audubon Society who got this ball rolling, and this is in the the mid-70s, and also the governor of Florida at the time and a few other people. And I moved to Florida in 1979 with my parents, and it was just at that moment where the Florida panther was nominated as Florida's symbol of wilderness, right? And it's a very important transition. It has to go from an agricultural pest to noble icon of the wilderness. And so, it became every school basically went out their way to kind of get rid of their old mascots and to become golden panthers. Actually, FIU did that while I was there. They used to be called the Sunblazers, which I always liked more. In the 1980s, there was not much of a conservative backlash against the millions and millions of extra dollars put into mediating and turning that highway, Alligator Alley, into a branch of I-75, an interstate highway, but doing so in a very permeable way. Okay, so one could argue, here's an example where a transportation sector very effectively came together with the natural resource and environmental lobby, the people running around in Florida, and there wasn't much of a conservative backlash. But it is controversial, especially in the 90s, and the project was very effective. Very few golden panthers get killed on I-75. Now they just got killed on all the other streets, especially in western Florida. Naples and western Florida is encroaching further and further, and out into the habitat of the golden panther, and that's where the spotted owl thing comes in. Why do we have to, why are we holding up development further, more golf courses or more suburban developments for the sake of the golden panther? And it's very similar to the debate about the jobs of our lumberjack communities who need to make a living going out there and harvesting a resource. So in a way, I don't mean to go on this, but the Florida panther story is a complex one, right? And there are different phases to it. And it starts off as, everyone in Florida coming to the rescue of this beautiful exotic creature that so few people have actually seen too, except in pictures and on videos. But now it's becoming it's a much more embattled issue, just like deer are up here and everywhere in northern United States as they come into contact with suburban developments, and people start scratching their heads wondering, okay, what are we going to do with all the deer in my lawn, eating my gardens and stuff like that. So,
Thank you.
You're welcome.